Today, I understand we're learning about Galatians and have been for the past few weeks. Now, I don't know about you, but this section of Galatians always makes me laugh a little bit because Paul's he's so angry, but in a righteous, sort of passionate, how can you do this kind of way? And because I used to write, I'm also a bit of a storyteller, so you're probably going to hear a lot of stories during my sermon today, because I think that people learn the best through stories, and I like to tell stories. So my first story today is this. I want you to imagine that you're having swimming lessons, okay? You're coming over to the pool for swimming lessons every Sunday, and I'm teaching you how to swim. Now I want you to imagine that, at first you're really nervous and you're really afraid and you don't even want to get into the water. But by the second week and the third week, you're starting to have fun. You're splashing around and you're playing in the water, and you're thinking, hey, this is actually kind of fun. And then by the 5th week and the 6th week, you're actually starting to hold your breath and blow bubbles and float. And you're starting to think, okay, water's kind of a cool thing. And then by the 7th and 8th week, you are absolutely loving swimming and you're thinking it's the best thing ever. And you've realized that the water holds you up and keeps you floating. And you're so excited about what you've learned and what you can do. You've had this really wonderful swimming experience and you just think that swimming is the best thing ever. But then, something happens, and maybe I just go off on holidays for a couple of weeks, and another swimming teacher comes along and says, you've been learning how to swim all wrong. You need to learn how to swim with armbands. You need to learn how to swim with floaties, because that's how we learned how to swim. And suddenly everything that you thought you knew about swimming, it's just gone. Suddenly you've forgotten that you know how to float. Suddenly you've forgotten that you know how to have the water hold you up. Suddenly everything that you've learned about swimming, you can't remember, and you suddenly think, oh, I need the armbands, I need the floaties to help me float. Can you imagine what it would be like to be in that position? To have that amazing experience of knowing how to swim, and then suddenly going back to thinking that you need the floats and the armbands to hold you up in the water. Well, that is the reason that Paul was getting so frustrated with these Galatians. You see, they had had the swimming experience. They went in deep. They had learned how to swim. They had learned about the gospel. They had learned about what Jesus had done for them. They had had the full experience. But as soon as Paul went away, these other people, these Jewish Christians, had come along and said, well, you don't need to listen to Paul. You need your armbands, you need your circumcision, you need your Jewish laws, you need all these things that we do in order to be able to swim and learn the gospel. Can you see why Paul was frustrated? He thought that he had brought the people into the gospel experience, that they understood the sacrifice that Jesus had made for them. And now, suddenly, it was like they had gone backwards and they had forgotten that they knew how to swim. Leon Morris, an Australian theologian, he says that Galatians is a passionate letter, the outpouring of the soul of a preacher on fire for the Lord, deeply committed to getting his hearers to an understanding of what saving faith is. And I love that description, because in here, I don't just see an irate man. I don't just see an angry preacher. I see someone who is on fire for God, someone who's so eager to show people what the gospel means. And I see his frustration with people who aren't willing to accept that the gospel is something that's natural, that is something that is given to them freely as a gift, rather than something that they need to earn or something that they need to do works for. There are 3 sort of main themes that you see in the book of Galatians. We've got authority. Whose authority should the Galatians be following? Are they following God's authority, or are they following the authority of these Jewish Christians? You've got the theme of the gospel, of salvation. What does salvation really mean? Is salvation what Paul preaches it to be, or is it something that it's earned? And number 3, you've got the theme of unity. You know, God's people can't believe half of this, and half of this, and half of this. And the book of Galatians is about uniting believers, not only the male and the female, not only the Jews and the Greeks, not only those who are slaves and those who are free, but people who all believe in the same gospel message. Why is this something that's relevant for us today? Well, as I go from church to church, I see these are 3 issues that are still really important for us to consider today. We still need to think about who our authority is, whether our authority comes from God or whether it comes from man. We still have the same issue of salvation. We've still got the same arguments in the church about whether or not salvation is something that we earn or whether it's something that is freely given. And we still have that same issue about unity. You know, even among Bible-believing church members, we can still have disunity and disruption, and unity is still an important issue for us to think about today. So this is why I think Galatians is still an important book for us to read today, because the same issues that the Galatians and Paul were going through back then are the same issues that we are going through right now. Let's turn in our Bibles, if you've got them, to Galatians chapter 3. Galatians chapter 3, and we'll start off with verse 1. Galatians chapter 3 and verse 1. And Paul starts off strongly. He says, "O foolish Galatians, who has cast an evil spell on you? For the meaning of Jesus Christ's death was made as clear to you as if you had seen a picture of his death on the cross." You know, Paul doesn't pull any punches. When I try to talk to people, I don't want to be confrontational. I usually try to say something really gentle first, and then I sort of ease into what I really want to say. And Paul doesn't do that. He knows straight away what he wants to say. He wants to grab their attention. He wants to make it really clear to them that he thinks that what they're doing is something silly. If you actually look at the Greek, you know, the Greek words that he uses here are interesting. So the normal Greek word that he could have used was moros. And that Greek word is where in English we derive the word moron, which is meant to imply that they were naturally stupid. He did not say they were naturally stupid. He said they were anitos, which is a Greek word that means they were mentally capable of understanding, but they were not being spiritually discerning. So he was saying, I know that you have the capacity to understand this message. You have understood this message before, and it is your stubbornness that is preventing you from understanding it now. It is your lack of spiritual discernment that is preventing you from understanding the same message that you once understood before. We go on to verse 2. Let me ask you this one question. Did you receive the Holy Spirit by obeying the law of Moses? Of course not. You received the Spirit because you believed the message that you heard about Christ. How foolish can you be? After starting your new lives in the Spirit, why are you now trying to become perfect by your own human effort? Have you experienced so much for nothing? Surely it was not in vain, was it? And this is definitely something that I know that people can struggle with, and it's this idea that they have to become perfect on their own merits, that they have to earn salvation on their own. I want to tell you a story about a man named Tom. Now, do we have any Toms in the audience today? Tom's a safe name to use? Okay, so imagine there's this man named Tom, and all his life Tom has only ever wanted one thing. He has only ever wanted to go on a cruise. You know, he loves the idea of going to an exotic country. He loves the idea of going and meeting a bunch of new people and making friends. And he loves the idea of just being able to sail on the open seas. Now, has anyone here been on a cruise before? A few of you have. So you might see where this is going, so don't spoil it for me, okay? So the problem that Tom had was that he really wanted to go on a cruise, but he was also really bad about spending money. He hated spending money. You know, he hoarded his money like anything. He was what we would call a cheapskate. Now, the problem is that every birthday and every Christmas, Tom's relatives had to listen to Tom, and Tom would always be complaining, I wish I could go on a cruise. And then his brothers or his sisters or his parents would say, well, just save up the money and go. And always Tom would go, no, it's too much money. I can't afford to go, it's too much money. But oh, I'd really, really love to go. Now, one Christmas, Tom's brother Bill, he'd heard so much about Tom's whinging, about wanting to go on a cruise, and then never actually saving up the money to go. And one Christmas, he bought Tom a cruise ticket, and he said, this is your ticket, Tom, you can go on a cruise. Now, how would you feel if you had just been given a ticket to go on a cruise, and all your life that was what you'd really wanted? Would you be excited? Well, Tom was excited at first, but then he started to get worried. You see, he'd been looking at the brochures about cruises for a long time, and he noticed that in all these brochures, there were all these beautiful restaurants and nice cafes and beautiful high teas and buffets and all these special treats. And he started to worry, I wonder how much all this food is going to cost. But it was all right, because Tom was a smart man and he came up with a great solution. You know, in some bakeries in Sydney, you can only sell bread fresh for one day before you have to give it away. So Tom went to all the bakeries that he could. He collected all the day-old bread that he could, and then he went home and filled as many bottles as he could with tap water. And on the day of the cruise, Tom was carrying 2 huge suitcases. One suitcase had his clothes and all the essentials that he thought he would need, and in his other suitcase, he had all this day-old bread and bottles of tap water. Now, as Tom boarded the ship, he could smell these amazing smells wafting out from the restaurants. He could see people walking around with plates of, piled up plates filled with beautiful looking food. And he just sighed and squared his shoulders and he said, it's all right, I've got my bread and I've got my water. And he went straight down to his cabin and he ate his bread and he drank his water. Now, how many days do you think that you could last on just dry bread and water? Half a day? And remember, there's all this temptation surrounding him. There are all these beautiful smells. He can see all the people coming out with their plates of food. He can see all the fancy restaurants, and it becomes torture for him. And by day 3 or day 4, his bread's starting to get stale and mouldy, and he's starting to get a little bit bored with drinking water, and he's starting to think, what am I doing? So what do you think he does? Do you think he goes and hits the buffet? Put your hands up. Do you think that he sticks to his bread and water? Put your hands up. Were you too much of a chicken to answer that question? Put your hands up. There's always at least one. Well, what Tom did was he decided that the best thing he could do was lock himself away from all the temptation. And so he locked himself in his cabin with his bread and his water. Day 6 of the cruise passed. Day 7, day 8, and Tom is missing out on everything that he wanted to do on a cruise. You know, Tom went on the cruise expecting to go to new countries, and he hasn't done that. Tom was thinking he was going to make lots of new friends and meet lots of people, and he hasn't done that. In fact, the only thing that Tom's done is he is technically sailing on the open sea, but the only view of the sea he gets is from the little porthole window in his cabin. day 9 passes, and finally it's day 10, and it's the last day of the cruise. And Tom is out of bread, and Tom is out of water, and Tom is oh so weak and very, very, very hungry. And he starts to think to himself, it's the last day of the cruise. I've done really well not to spend any money. Maybe today, because it's the last day, I'll just give it a go. And so slowly and painfully, he pushes open his door, and he blinks a little bit because he hasn't seen natural sunlight for a while. And weak and tired and hungry, he slowly makes his way upstairs to the cheapest looking restaurant. And the waiter's really alarmed when he sees him because he's all pale and tired and really looking hungry. And he says, "Sir, are you okay? What can I do for you? What can I get you?" And Tom just says, "I just want a bowl of your cheapest soup." And what do you think the waiter said to him? The waiter looked at him and said, "But sir, didn't you know that all the food on our boat is free?" Poor old Tom. Poor old Tom. You know, he was on the cruise of a lifetime that he'd been dreaming about. He could have been feasting for days, and yet he chose to stay locked in his cabin with his bread and his water. But do you know what? Sometimes we're kind of like Tom. And you're thinking, no, I would never say no to a free buffet. But do you know what? Jesus offers us the biggest eternal banquet that you can ever imagine. You know, it's better than any cruise ship buffet. It's better than any restaurant. It's better than any high tea. And he offers it all, and he says, "I'm the bread of life. I'm the water of life. Whoever comes to me is never going to be hungry or thirsty again because you've got everything that you need in me." And yet we're turning to this. We're turning to Jesus' offer, and we're saying to him, "But it's okay, Jesus. I've got my bread and I've got my water. You know, we can do it. We can do this. We've got it. We can do this on our own." And this is why Paul is saying to the Galatians, what are you doing? You've had your chance to sample an eternal banquet that's better than anything that you can ever imagine. And yet you're still trying to bring your own bread and your own water along and thinking that that's good enough. Have you ever been guilty of being a Tom? I know I have. Let's go on. So in verse 5, Galatians chapter 3, verse 5, Paul says, "I ask you again, does God give you the Holy Spirit and work miracles among you because you obey the law? Of course not. It is because you believe the message you heard about Christ. In the same way, Abraham believed God, and God counted him righteous because of his faith. The real children of Abraham, then, are those who put their faith in God." Verse 8, "What's more, the scriptures looked forward to this time when God would make the Gentiles right in his sight because of their faith. God proclaimed this good news to Abraham a long time ago when he said, 'All nations will be blessed through you.' So all who put their faith in Christ share the same blessing that Abraham received because of his faith." You know, those Jewish Christians, they were coming along and telling the new Christians, the Gentiles, they were saying, in order to really be considered a son of Abraham, you've got to be circumcised. You've got to follow all the laws that we do. You know, that's the only way that you can have Jesus. That's the only way you can have the gospel. And here Paul is saying, no. You know, the reason that Abraham had a connection with God was because of his faith in God. And you can have that faith in God, and I can have that faith in God. You know, we all can have that faith in God. It's not something that's passed down to one person or to one group of people. It's something that is available to anybody who freely chooses to believe in Jesus. What is the difference between following the law and following the gospel? Well, I think following the law is still an important thing to do. I mean, when you're driving out there, you want to make sure that everyone's stopping at the red lights and going at the green lights. Otherwise, you would end up with a pretty chaotic situation. But the law itself is not what saves people. I once heard an analogy that went like this. So there were two boys, and both of them were out for a joyride one night. And it was really late at night, and they were tired, and they probably shouldn't have been driving out so late, but they wanted to anyway. And unfortunately, one of the boys, he got a bit tired and was falling asleep at the wheel, and then all of a sudden they hear this loud smack and they've hit a tree. And the front of the car is completely dented. There's really obvious damage that needs to be repaired. And the boys, they look at each other, and once they've sort of established that the other is okay, they start thinking about the car. And one boy, he's like, oh no, my dad's going to kill me. My dad's going to kill me. I can't tell him anything. What am I going to do? And then the other boy looks at him and he goes, I'm in trouble, you're in trouble, we should call my dad. And I think that's the difference between being religious and having the gospel message. Because religion says, I've made a mistake, I've screwed up, oh no, God is going to kill me. And the gospel says, oh no, I've made a mistake, I've screwed up, I need to talk to my dad. What kind of relationship do you have with your dad? Do you have the relationship with God that says, oh no, I've screwed up, he's going to kill me? Or do you have the kind of relationship where you go, oh no, I've screwed up, I've got to call him? This is the difference between religiosity and gospel. But, it's not something that's easy for Galatians or for us to be able to do, to just automatically think that God is love. But we have to remember that God has already given the greatest demonstration of his love to us through Jesus. When God gave Jesus to us, when Jesus was sacrificed for our sins, he has already given the greatest demonstration of love. He has already paid the biggest penalty. How can we ever imagine that anything else that we go through is going to be worth more than that? But how can we know that we have this love? I once talked to a guy who was a literature evangelist in Thailand, and he said that during that time, he would just really struggle to sort of believe that God was with him, because he would go sometimes days, weeks, without selling books, without having any connection. And he finally just thought, maybe God doesn't really care about me and my family. Maybe God, wants me to be somewhere else. Maybe I'm not doing enough literature evangelism. I don't know, but something's wrong. And he was, thinking these sorts of depressing thoughts until one day he knocked on a door, and it turned out to be the door of a Baptist preacher. And the man looked at him and he said, what have you got? Show me what you have. And so this literature evangelist, he sits down and he starts showing him his books about the gospel and about health and about depression. And, he shows him all these books. And they engage in a really deep theological conversation. And, this literature evangelist, he's excited because he knows the answers to all these theological questions. And then suddenly he gets this question he doesn't expect. The preacher turns to him and he says, I'm really interested in all this stuff that you're telling me, brother. You've got this doctrine and that doctrine, and this is all really interesting. But I just want to know one thing from you. If Jesus was to come back today, do you think that you would be saved? And the literature evangelist froze, because that was the one question that he wasn't sure of. He didn't believe that his salvation was assured. He wasn't sure that God really wanted him. And he just stood there, trembling and not able to give an answer. And he said it wasn't until many years later, when he discovered the real love of Christ, that he was able to say with confidence, I am saved and I believe that I am saved. If Jesus was to come back today, how many of you would believe that you have assurance of salvation? The Bible says, For God so loved the world that whosoever shall not, but have. It's one of the first verses that you learn as a child. It's often one of the verses that you memorize, even when you forget all your other memory verses. But it's something that is so hard sometimes to remember, that God has given us this assurance, that he says that whoever believes in him shall not perish and have everlasting life. We have this assurance of salvation. We have a God who has promised to come back for us, and we need to keep believing in that promise. This is where we get confused about where we need to be or what we need to do or what we should be doing. You know, all we really need to be doing is clinging onto Jesus and going, you've got this, God. We believe you've got this. You know, you have us covered. I wasn't going to tell this story, but some friends of mine from Wollongong reminded me about this story, and I think it's actually a pretty good analogy for the message of the Galatians today. So there was once this little boy, and I don't know whether it was something that happened at birth or whether it was an accident, but this little boy, he had no right arm. He was missing his right arm. And at school, you know, everyone would tease him, would bully him, make fun of him, and it got so bad that this poor child, you know, he was really upset. He hated going to school. He hated, you know, coming home in tears, and his parents just didn't know what to do with him. And then one day, the counsellor, they called his parents in and said, you know, what your boy needs is a hobby. You know, give him something to learn, some skill that he can improve in, something that he can get better at. And then, you know, he'll be able to focus on that instead of his missing arm. And his parents thought, well, that's a really great idea. Let's do that. And, you know, they went and they asked their boy, hey, son, you know, we'd like to give you some lessons. What would you like to learn? And they're expecting maybe he'd want to sing, or maybe he'd want to learn how to cook. And he says, Mum, Dad, you know what I really want? I'd really like to learn karate. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't know much about karate, but I feel like, you know, you probably do need to use your arms and your legs and stuff. And his parents were starting to get really worried, and they were like, oh no, what are we going to tell him? We said he could do anything. And they first tried to dissuade him. And then finally they said, okay, son, if we can find a teacher who's willing to teach you, you know, then you can learn karate. And they went to the first teacher. And the first teacher said, oh no, I'm too busy. I've got too many students. I can't afford to take your son on. And then they went to the second coach, and the coach said, oh, look, I'm sorry, but I don't know how to look after and teach students like your son. You know, you'll have to go to someone who's trained to do this. And then they went to the third coach, and the third coach said, not only can I teach your son karate, but I'm going to make him so good that he is going to win the karate championship in just 3 weeks' time. Wow, that seems like quite a promise to make, doesn't it? And the boy was super excited and yes, you know, this is my teacher. This is the one I'm going to learn from. And his parents were just anxious and going, why do you want to get his hopes up? You know, what are we going to do when he doesn't win? And the coach said, remember, I'm only going to ask 2 things from you. I want you to follow my instructions and to trust me. So the first lesson comes, and the boy learns a special move. And he's so excited that he practices that move every day until he gets it absolutely perfect. And the next week he goes back for his lesson and he shows the teacher his move, and the teacher's like, yeah, that's great, you've done a really good job. And he says, okay, what are we going to do today? The same move. And the boy says, but why? You know, I already know this move. I want to learn something else. And the coach says, remember, I've only asked 2 things of you: to follow my instructions and to trust me. So the boy practices, and he gets to move absolutely perfect. And the next week he comes back to the teacher and he's like, what are we going to learn today? And the teacher says, we're going to keep practicing that same move. And the boy gets discouraged and he says, but I want to learn something new. I want to learn something different. And he goes, no. Remember, I've only asked 2 things of you: to follow my instructions and to trust me. Then comes the third lesson, and this is the lesson before the big karate championship, the one that this boy's been told that he's about to win. And he says, well, today you've got to teach me a new move because it's the competition next week. What are you going to teach me? What are you going to teach me? And what do you think the coach says? The same move. And again, the boy's so frustrated, but he does as he's told. Then finally comes the day of the big karate championship, and the boy's nervous, and as they get to the beginning, he's starting to get scared, and he says, turn around, coach, let's go in the car and go home. Let's go home. I can't do this. And his coach says again, you can do this. Just remember to follow my instructions and to trust me. So he goes up and he's against a boy who's been learning for roughly around the same amount of time, is roughly around the same age, has about the same amount of experience. And what do you think happens? Hands up if he wins. Hands up if he loses. Hands up if it's a draw. Well, he wins. And he wins again, and he wins again until he gets to the final championship round, where he's against a guy who's been karate champion for the last 5 years. And by this time, he's really nervous, and he's sweating, and he's shaking like a jelly. And he says to his coach, Coach, I can't do this. And his coach says, what are you talking about? You've been doing the same thing all along. Just keep doing the same thing. And he goes, but coach, this guy is so much stronger than I am. This guy is so much more experienced than I am. This guy is tougher than any other guy I've been up against before. I can't beat him. And his coach says, remember, I've only asked 2 things of you, to follow my instructions and to trust me. So, he's looking down at the floor. He's shaking like a jelly. He gets up on the stage and he faces this karate champion. And what do you think happens? Who thinks he wins? Who thinks he loses? Anders, ye of little faith. He wins. He wins and he's so excited and he's over the moon. And as they walk out of the championship stadium, he's clutching his trophy under his arm and he can't believe that he's won and he's so excited. And he says to his coach, but coach, I don't understand. How did I win? And the coach said, remember, I told you that you would win. You only had to follow my instructions and to trust me. But coach, seriously, no. How did I win? How did I beat that guy? And his coach smiled and said, well, you know that move that you've been practicing. And he goes, oh, of course, I know that move. It's the only thing I know. And he says, well, there is only one other move that can counteract that move that I taught you. And that's why you won. And the boy sort of thought about it for a little bit. And for a moment he was satisfied. And then he started getting, a bit confused again. And he said, but coach, that other boy that I was competing against, he was the karate champion for 5 years. He's got so much experience. He's been doing this for such a long time. He must know that move that could counteract my move. And his coach smiled and he's like, yeah, I'm pretty sure he did know that move. Then why, coach? Why didn't he use that move on me? And his coach smiled and he said, because to use that move that would counteract the move that you've been practicing, you need to grab the other person's right arm. So the thing that this boy with the missing arm thought was his greatest weakness was the thing that became his greatest strength, all because he trusted his coach. And this is what we need to do in our walk as Christians. There are going to be times when we are up against really strong challenges. We're going to be up against opposition. Satan is out there trying to get us, and we're going to be like, God, what do we do? God, how can we beat Satan? He's so experienced at tempting people. He's been doing this for eternity. He's been trying to attack me. What can I do? I'm just a weak, helpless, sinful human being. And God says, remember, I've only asked 2 things of you: to follow my instructions, but more importantly, to trust me. And this is our secret to living the life of a Christian walk. Not believing that the law will save us, still keeping it because it means an orderly, society, but ultimately believing that Jesus is our coach. Jesus is the one who has done it already, and Jesus is the one who is paying it for us every day. So that's what I want you to remember. When you struggle with this idea of what is the gospel and what is religiosity, I want you to remember your personal experiences with Jesus. I want you to remember what it was like to first hear that Jesus died for you, and to remember that He's constantly paying the price so that we may be righteous before God under His